Hello, everyone. If I were to stand before you and take out a pack of smokes out of my pocket and light up a cigarette, you'd probably think I'm crazy, right? Well, for starters, you can't really smoke in here. And second, we all know how bad for your health smoking is, right? These days, it is common knowledge, but it wasn't always like this. You see, people didn't really start smoking on a massive scale until after the First World War, some years after the first automated cigarette manufacturing machine was invented. And it had to take a couple of decades before researchers started linking increasing incidence of lung cancer with smoking. In 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States published a report on smoking and health, and the report stated very clearly that smoking is deadly. Yet it wasn't until a couple more decades before this knowledge and this awareness became a mainstream. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, I think we have a great example of history repeating itself, and this time it is about sitting. You see, for some time now, some scientists have been saying that sitting can actually be just as harmful or even more harmful than smoking. And not a lot of people are aware of that. So hello again, my name is Marek, and as you might have probably guessed, this talk won't be very technical. I've been a programmer for more than 10 years, but it's not really important at the moment. Now, I'm standing here before you to tell you how dangerous actually prolonged sitting can be. So let's dive right into it. How is it that sitting kills you? So in the year 2014, this book was published titled Get Up. The author of it, Dr. James Levine, happens to be a world-renowned expert on topics like obesity, sedentariness, and negative effects of prolonged sitting. And this doctor is quite serious when he says that sitting is the new smoking. Going back to smoking actually for a bit. So in the year 2000, researchers and scientists wanted to find a way how to convey to the general public the dangers of smoking. And so they did these calculations, these estimates, that one cigarette smoked might cost a smoker 11 minutes of his or her life. And for the whole lifespan, that would mean 7 years lost, compared to a non-smoker. Now, Dr. Levine, in his book, argues that 1 hour of sitting can actually cost us 2 hours of our lives, which is quite shocking, right? And it was also shocking to me when I read about it, so I did some similar calculations, some simple math. I made some assumptions as to at what age we usually start our professional careers, how much we spend sitting on our average day, etc., and I've arrived at this rough estimate of 15 years lost due to sitting. Let's keep that number in mind because we'll revisit it. Now, the idea that sitting can be harmful, dangerous, might seem ridiculous to you. After all, this is a very, very natural thing to us. We do it all the time. But again, was it always like this? Well, not necessarily. If we take a look at the wider time horizon here, we'll see that our cousins and our ancestors, they evolved as bipeds, that is, creatures moving on 2 legs. And what was natural to us then and to them? Movement in an upright position. They did sit, of course, but it wasn't the norm. It was the means to relax and to rest after hours of exploration, hunting, and a bit later after hours of agricultural work. Now, in modern times, how does it look like? So we can say that around 70 to 70 years ago, the so-called digital revolution started. And with it came the era of computers and office work. It's been estimated that in the 60s and in the 70s, around 50% of jobs involved at least a moderate amount of movement. An example might be a worker at a factory, at a production line, or a worker at the printing press. But in the 21st century, it is now estimated that more than 80% of jobs, of workers, sit on their buttocks all their workdays. And the trend continues. Now, the problem is not only our jobs, though. Because let's take a look at our average day, right? We get up, we sit down to have our breakfast, we sit in our cars, on a tram, on a bus while we commute, then of course in front of our computers. We go back to sit down to have our dinner in front of a TV. For example, when we go to a doctor, what do we usually do? We look for a place to sit down. And so it is now estimated that on an average day, people spend 8 hours sleeping, 3 hours moving, and 13 hours sitting. It is that bad. And so one might wonder, where will that kind of a lifestyle lead us? Well, we were able to see that actually, and in the year of 2007, when this awesome animated movie was released, WALL-E. Highly recommended if you haven't watched it. So in this movie, we were able to see a picture of a society in which people are so obese and their muscles are so deteriorated that they can no longer move by themselves. Now, by now you're probably wondering what it is exactly about sitting that is so harmful to us. Well, so it turns out that prolonged sitting affects both our bodies and our minds. Let's start with the body. In the year 2009, a paper was published, Sitting Time and Mortality from All Causes, Cardiovascular Disease and Cancer. So in that paper, researchers summarized a 12 years long prospective study on a cohort of 17,000 Canadians, ages 18 to 90. And the researchers found a statistically significant correlation between how long a person sits on average on their day with their general mortality, as well as mortality due to cardiovascular disease, which actually happens to be the #1 cause of death according to the list published by the World Health Organization. And the numbers that you see here, so for the group of people, for people who spent almost all their days sitting, they had 50% higher risk of dying. And let's be honest, probably the majority of us here is in this group. But one might argue that this is just one paper. Well, not really, because over the last 2 or 3 decades, there have been many studies that linked sedentariness in general to a multitude of health issues. And Dr. Levine, in his book, even has something that he calls an alphabet of sitting illnesses. We won't be going over all of those. I just wanted to point out a few. So, of course, when we talk about prolonged sitting, we immediately think about problems with the back, right, with the spine. But that's just for starters. So prolonged sitting has also been linked to problems with blood pressure, specifically hypertension, colon cancer. And the next two, diabetes, type 2 diabetes and obesity, like the plague of our modern civilization, right? Heart attack, musculoskeletal disorders, and so on and so on. But we are not done yet. Because let's think now what sedentariness does to our brains. So I think it is common knowledge by now that physical activity is good for us, right? And it's good for mental health and for our brains. It's been shown that, just taking a simple walk can actually improve our cognitive functions and creativity. And they knew that even in ancient times. Aristotle, for example, he founded this school called the Peripatetic School, in which there was a common practice of walking back and forth during lectures or during different disputes on scientific and philosophical matters. Now, so what happens when we sit down? Well, for starters, we become grumpy. You might know this phrase, grumpy programmer, grumpy IT support guy, and sedentariness might be one of the reasons such a phrase even exists. What happens? What can also happen? So, when we sit down, we become sad. We might become anxious, angry, and depressed even, and we definitely get stressed out. Because when we sit down, the levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, raise within our bodies. And Dr. Levine observed that one of the major problems in our current society is that when we get stressed out, instead of getting up and going for a run, we sit down and we eat. So I hope I was able to convince you that a lot of these so-called civilization diseases can actually be traced back to sedentariness, to prolonged sitting. Of course, there are other factors at play here, like poor nutrition, for example, or lack of sleep. But I think we can all agree that sedentariness, contributes greatly to early deaths across the world. So now a natural question then arises, right? Well, is there anything we can do about it? And the answer is yes. But before we get to that, I have some bad news. Some bad news to those of you who might think that these kind of problems don't concern you because you already lead this so-called active life. You have this active lifestyle. So you regularly go to a gym, or go for a run, play squash, what have you. Now the thing is, it turns out that it's just simply not enough to be active in your leisure time. It just won't negate all the negative effects of this prolonged sitting. And in order to find out, to convince ourselves that it is actually the case, let's go back to this Canadian fitness study. So the numbers that we see here are so-called these are hazard ratios. This is a term from statistics and epidemiology. And in this context, we can interpret it as a relative risk of dying depending on how much time a person spends sitting on their average day. And so, for example, a hazard ratio of 1.5 means 50% higher risk of dying. And the darker the bar, the more time a person spends sitting. Now, what I wanted to point out in this particular slide, we have two diagrams. Because one of the things the researchers did, they stratified people into two groups, inactive and active. The active group, people in this group would declare that they lead this active lifestyle, they regularly physically exercise or play some sports. Now, if you take a closer look at the absolute values of hazard ratios, you will see that for the inactive group, these numbers are higher. However, the thing is that the trend is still there for the active group. So even if you do lead this active lifestyle, but if you spend almost all your day sitting, you will still have 40% higher risk of dying. And there's another myth I wanted to debunk, which has to do with ergonomic chairs. So you might have heard about this company, this manufacturer Herman Miller, which produces this iron chair, which a lot of people say that this is the most comfortable chair in the world. You might not even realize that you've seen it already in a movie or in a TV series, because it seems that Herman Miller likes product placements just as much Apple does, with its products. And but the problem with ergonomic chairs is that they weren't designed to be healthy. Fortunately, they were designed to be comfortable. And one of the major problems with sitting down is that when we sit down, our core muscles, our abdominal muscles, they simply shut down. They have nothing to do because normally their function is to stabilize our spines. Now, if our back is comfortably supported, they have nothing to do. And as we know, a muscle which is not being used slowly deteriorates. Now, the funny thing here is that even Herman Miller admits that. So in 2013, they published an article titled "Sit, Stand, move and repeat, in which they said that, I'll try to quote here, that the causal chain between prolonged sitting and potential health problems exists even if a person sits in a highly adjustable ergonomic chair. So you have to agree that something's up if even a chair manufacturer says things like that. But that brings us closer to the solution. We just have to move more throughout our whole day, not just in our leisure time. Right? Easier said than done. So you might think, okay, so what does it mean? That our employers should, provide gyms for us, and we should work out every day or something? While that it's not actually a bad idea, I have something else in mind. In order to understand what, we'll have to talk about this thing called need. So need stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis and is a topic that's is being studied by Dr. Levine and others for quite a while now. So what is this thermogenesis? Basically, it's a set of processes that happens within bodies of all warm-blooded animals, and that, of course, includes humans, that produce heat. And there are three basic types of thermogenesis. So the first one is so-called the diet-induced. After we eat our meals, the body starts producing, using, and storing energy. The second is exercise-related. When we physically exercise, we, of course, burn calories. Now, this third type, non-exercise-related, is the energy expenditure due to all other activities, such as such trivial activities like just simply taking your dog for a walk, or gardening, like even doing the dishes. It is like this long tail on the metabolic rate, right? And Dr. Levine and others have shown that the amount of calories that you burn due to such activities can actually add up to a substantial amount. In other words, this is like a natural, spontaneous movement that burns calories. It's a really important concept, and so in order to reinforce it, I'll tell you also about this Blue Zones project. So a couple of years ago, Dan Buettner, together with National Geographic and National Institute on Aging, they set out to find places on Earth where people would live considerably longer than the general population. And a few years back, they did just that. So they identified 5 such regions, like Sardinia in Italy or Okinawa Islands in Japan, where the number of the so-called centenarians, that is people who got to live to be 100 years old or older, was significantly higher. And they identified 9 common traits to these regions. They call them the Power 9. We won't be going over all of them, although I do recommend to encourage you to check out more information about this project. What I wanted to point out, though, is that at the very top of the pyramid, which is this natural, spontaneous movement. Because you see, Dan said in his talks and wrote in his books that he got to talk to a lot of these centenarians. I think there were more than 200 of them. And he said that no one would, declare that they would lead this active lifestyle. I mean, that they didn't physically exercise, at least not in our sense of the word. Instead, physical activity and movement was just naturally interwoven into their daily lives. And so even though they didn't exercise in our sense of the word, they got to live on average 10 years longer than the rest of us. And so if we go back to the beginning of the presentation and this rough estimate of years lost due to sitting, I think Dr. Levine is definitely onto something here. So I hope that you get this concept and the importance of this natural, spontaneous movement. As I said, we have to move more throughout our whole days, throughout our days, not just in our leisure time. And actually, I think that the very first step that we can do in the right direction is to simply stand up. Because the mere fact of standing raises our metabolic rate by about 30%. It improves our blood flow, blood circulation. When we stand, our abdominal muscles, our core muscles, which, as I said, are supposed to stabilize the spine, now have something to do. When we stand, we also tend to fidget more, which increases our needs. And in some sense, standing is a gateway for other forms of movement. And let's remember that the movement is our end goal here. But for now, we are focusing on this first step of standing up. And yes, as you can see, I am talking about height adjustable standing desks. You all probably seen them. You might have even tried them. But I bet not a lot of you work in a standing position on a regular basis. And I really, really encourage you to try. Now, one potential problem, if your employer doesn't provide such equipment, let me tell you a story. So a while back, I was working for a company almost 100% of the time remotely. And so I wanted to create a nice workplace for myself at home. I was already into working in a standing position, so I set out to find this nice electrically adjustable standing desks. At the time, and they were quite expensive, they're still very expensive, and so I was able to bring down the cost by ordering the parts separately and assembling the desk myself, but it was still very expensive. But it worked quite fine, quite okay. So, but after some time, I decided to change jobs, and I had to go back to an office because remote work was no longer an option there. And so imagine my disappointment when I found out there are no height adjustable desks there. Fortunately, I noticed that a couple of colleagues in an adjacent room, somehow they managed to work in a standing position. And the solution that I implemented was so simple yet so brilliant that I just had to copy it, which was just taking an IKEA table, attaching a shelf to it, and putting a keyboard on it. Yeah, but now the funny thing is that I like this setup even more than my quite expensive setup at home. And I'll tell you why that was. So the problem with working in a standing position is that you just won't be able to do it all day long while maintaining both your productivity and while maintaining proper posture. But fortunately, that is not something that researchers recommend. Instead, you should alternate between those positions. And especially when you're just starting out, don't get too ambitious. Don't try to stand all day long. Alternate these positions. Like even 10-15 minutes of standing and then sitting down is okay. But there is a problem with that. From my experience, with a manually adjustable desk or even electrically adjustable desk, there's this problem of having to switch these, the height of the desk quite often. So the problem was that it can get you distracted. You all probably heard about this mental state of flow or being in the zone, right? So when you are so focused on a task at hand, you're so productive, but you don't notice the flow of time. It's a very great state to be in, but the problem with it is that it's very volatile, right? An innocent question from a colleague will drag you out of this state, and you will need some time to get back to it. And that happened for me. Now, with the IKEA do-it-yourself sit-stand solution, the problem was gone because I had 2 monitors, 2 keyboards, a wireless mouse, and alternating the positions didn't take time whatsoever. And I loved it. So, if you wanted to try it out, just let me repeat the parts. So an IKEA table is called lac. It's pretty common and very cheap. A shelf brackets, a couple of screws, and you're good to go. Now, what is important here? So regardless of the sit-stand solution, that you choose, you have to keep a couple of basic things in mind. So one is that the monitor, the display has to be set up so its top edge is aligned with your eyes level. When you place your hand on a keyboard, your arms have to be bent at around 90 to 100 degrees. And the third thing is that while doing this kind of try-ons, and then while later working in a standing position, you have to maintain proper posture. You have to just simply stand correctly. But what does that mean exactly? In order to answer that question, let me turn to another book titled Deskbound. This is actually the book that really got me inspired to dig deeper into these topics. I highly, highly recommend it. It was a real eye-opener for me. Its author, Dr. Starrett, is a quite famous physiotherapist, a CrossFit trainer. So he works with world-class athletes, weightlifters, fighters, etc. And we won't have time to go into more detail about the things that he writes about in this book, but he distills the problem of our modern society to 3 points. One is that we simply don't move enough. We don't move correctly, and we do not regularly maintain our bodies. He addresses these points in his book. We'll focus on the second point, and actually, so because movement, has its starting position, and more often than not, it is the standing position. So Dr. Starrett spends quite a lot of time discussing and describing how to stand correctly. So I could tell you about it, I could show it to you, but I have a better idea. Let's just learn by doing. So if you can just stand up for like 2 minutes, we'll go through the process together. It's very simple. It's called the bracing sequence. So the first step is to put our feet parallel to each other, pointing forward. Right? We squeeze our gluteal muscles, that is our buttocks, and we try to screw our feet into the ground. By doing that, we exert an external force from our hips, and we stabilize our pelvis. Okay. In the second step, in a second, we'll take a deep breath, ideally through our diaphragms, and while we exhale, we keep 2 things in mind. So one is to tighten our abdominal muscles and make sure that our rib cage is positioned directly above our pelvis. Okay, so let's take a breath. And while we exhale, we keep our abdominal muscles tight. It doesn't have to be like 100% tight. It's like 20%. But also remember about the glutes. The third step is we pull our head a little backwards, right? So the idea here is simple. We just want to position ourselves so that our ears, our shoulders, our hips, our knees, and our ankles are in one nice vertical line. Sorry, we missed a step. Sorry about that. Right. We forgot about shoulders, right? Because, so anatomically speaking, we'll do a very similar thing that we did with our legs, right? So we exert an external rotational force from our shoulders, so our palms point forward, right? This stabilizes our shoulders. And then we do the fourth step with our head. Now we relax our forearms, our thumbs point forward, and that's it. This is the natural, healthy position for a human body. All right, thank you. You may sit down now, if you want, of course. And that concluded the second part of the talk. In the third one, I would like to tackle this topic from a different perspective, maybe a wider perspective. Because if you think about it, we've been hearing about the dangers of sedentariness for quite a while now, for many, many years. So in 1996, there was another report published by the Surgeon General of the United States, and this one was about physical activity and health. And even then, we could find statements like these in this report, that families need to weave physical activity into the fabric of their daily lives, or that the health professionals need to encourage their patients to get out of their chairs. Think about it, 1996, so it was more than 20 years ago now. So please tell me, why is it the case that our workplaces still look like these? Why the hell it seems that we keep sitting ourselves to death? Well, I can provide you a couple of reasons or excuses, if you will. So for starters, no awareness, very similar thing as with smoking, right? People are just not educated enough yet. Now, even if the awareness is there, and you would like to try out working in a standing position, there are a couple of problems with that. So one is that your employer doesn't provide such equipment, right? But I just showed you that it can be quite cheap, both figuratively and literally, to come up with your own, do-it-yourself sit-stand solution. And also for the company that I worked, it had like a bunch of offices in one city, more than 3,000 employees. And all of those offices were equipped with height adjustable desks. And guess how many people use them to work in a standing position? Almost nobody. So that's also not the actual problem here. And I have this hypothesis that there's this third problem, which is called fear. Fear of being ridiculed, fear of what others might think of you, maybe even fear of being ridiculed, pointed at, laughed at. Of course, it is just a hypothesis based on my experience and talking to some friends. But I really believe that is one of the biggest problems here, and one which doesn't have a trivial solution I could think of. Solving it would require some kind of a cultural shift. And we actually were able to see how such a shift might look like as far back as 2007. So there was this company, Silo, and the owner of this company knew Dr. Levine's work. He was actually kind of a fan of this work. And so he approached him and asked him if he could help him design a new office for his employees where they could test this neat idea of bringing more physical activity to employees. And Dr. Levine agreed, and what followed was a 2-year-long experiment in which people got to work in an environment like this. So not only everyone had a height-adjustable desk, they also put treadmills below them. So they could, walk at a very, very slow pace while talking over a phone or working on a computer. They also had like collision-less paths, across all the office, so they could take walking meetings. And other such small ideas, introduced more physical activity. Dr. Levine also set up a fully blown laboratory within this office, so he could measure cholesterol, blood pressure, sugar, and other health indicators of the employees. And the results of this experiment were quite phenomenal. So let's take a look at some of these benefits. So people definitely lost some weight, even gained some muscle tissue. The health indicators, they stabilized, they improved. What was important from the company perspective, the productivity and creativity were increased. Also, apparently, financial profits went higher. Now, but these benefits are not the ones that struck me the most when I read about this. What struck me the most is this: increased happiness. Because an interesting thing happened. Not too long into the experiment, people started to become more active, not only at their workplace, but also at in their homes. So suddenly they had this surge of energy to spend more time actively with their families, play with their kids, and the energy to pursue their dreams and goals for which they hadn't had energy before. And due to that, they were simply happier. So don't you think this is something worth fighting for? Dr. Levin definitely thought so. Just take a look at this quote from his book. At a personal, workplace, and national level, a chairless revolution, a national uprising of human movement will improve productivity and generate revenue, better health, clean air, and enhance happiness. Now, the sad thing is that this experiment took place more than 10 years ago. And even though these kind of ideas are being implemented more and more often, especially in the US, but it is we are far from mainstream, right? And so, in my opinion, this revolution is just not happening fast enough. And this is for my sake, your sake, as well as our children's sake. And so, when I read about this and was thinking about it, an idea for a project popped into my head. A project and initiative which is called Stand It Up. Let me explain. So I actually believe that Dr. Levin is right when he says that we are at the verge of revolution that will change our workplace. And I also think that the best chance to succeed, to speed up and to kickstart this revolution is to start with our own industry, IT. Why? Well, I think we all know how the jobs marketplace looks like for within IT industry for developers, testers, right? It's very tough for employers to find experienced specialists, to attract talent and to retain it, and so they can go quite far, in providing these so-called benefits. But I have an appeal to these employers. So instead of providing us chill-out rooms with latest video game consoles, why don't they provide us mini gyms? Instead of providing us free sweet snacks and Coca-Cola, why don't they reimburse us? Why don't they buy us height adjustable desks, or at least reimburse us for whatever do-it-yourself sit-stand solutions we come up with? I would even go so far as to say that we should work less, let's say 6-7 hours instead of 8, and of course earn the same amount of money. And we could use this time for activities like simple gymnastics, practicing yoga, doing some stretching, like even doing mindfulness, mind you. Now, of course, these activities would be spread out throughout the whole day in order to keep the NEAT levels high. In other words, right, so you heard me right. So I'm saying that we should work less, sit less, move more, earn the same amount of money. Right? In other words, I'm saying that we should stand up for ourselves, because in the end, this is our health on the line, and your employer doesn't care about your health, at least not in the long term. Because the brutal truth is that we are all expendable. And these benefits, the irony here is that by not providing these benefits, that I think we should be asking for or demanding even, there's this opportunity cost that these companies are paying, which is about not realizing the full potential of the workforce, just as the Salo experiment demonstrated. So a couple of more words about the project itself. This initiative. So there are three main goals. One is increasing raising the awareness by putting up some interesting stuff to read about on the website, of course, but also by reaching out to fellow geeks directly, attending meetups, speaking at conferences. The second thing is I would like this project to be able to facilitate this cultural shift. And I think in order to do that, we also have to reach out to employers and educate them as well. Tell them that it doesn't have to be so expensive, right? And in the end, it's a win-win situation. And lastly, I would like this project, to unite us within our industry, to provide a place both online and in real life where we can meet, talk, and share our ideas and experiences and ideas how to bring more physical activity into our workplaces. So we are nearing the end of the presentation, and the last thing I wanted to share with you is my motivation. Why am I even doing this? So I've been passionate about computers since I can remember. I think I was 7 or 8 years at the time when I wrote my first program. It was in BASIC on a Commodore 64. And I think that even since then, I knew what I wanted to become. I wanted to become a programmer, and so I did become one. And with that came countless hours of coding, and not just at my day job, right? Because for a geek like me, and probably for geeks like you, there's always something new, shiny, interesting just around the corner, new technology, new framework, or new side project, pet project worth developing, right? And so all these hours spent coding, of course, I spent sitting. Add to that the fact that I was also a smoker, and if you remember the numbers from the beginning of the presentation, about the years lost due to sitting and smoking, I don't know how it is that I'm still standing here, right? Now, human body is a marvelous machine. Why? Because it can sustain abuse for years and years. But it will break eventually, no doubt about that. And so my body was giving me the signals, but I didn't notice them, right? And so over my 10 years of professional career, I got to experience, let's call them, for three times, it's called breakdowns, right? Where I was completely burnt out, completely demotivated, not just, coding, but, depressed even. And fortunately, I was able to always dig out myself out of this, and this was mostly due to the help of my close ones, for which I'm very, very grateful. But the thing was that, after a while, I reverted doing the same thing, and the problem was returning. So you might have heard about this. You might have heard this quote. Supposedly it was Einstein who said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. And I was insane according to this definition. But fortunately, I think the last breakdown, something else happened. A switch flipped in my head, and I finally realized that in order for me to continue doing what I love the most, coding, and pursuing this career path, I have to change something about my life. Well, for starters, I need to quit smoking. I have to start moving more, and I also believe that it's equally important to quit sitting. Okay, so I open up a little here, right? It's maybe a bit too much. Now, I told you a story about myself, but was it only my story? Because I thought about this parable, which I recently learned that's not actually true, but it fits nicely here. So here it is. So apparently, if you take a living frog and put it into boiling water, it will just jump out of it, and it will live. But if you put it into cold water and start to slowly heat it up, the frog won't notice a steadily increasing temperature and will get cooked to death. So let me leave you with a question that I think we all should be asking ourselves. Could it be that we are all such frogs too? Thank you. I would really, really appreciate if you rated my talk, and we can do some questions. We have some time for questions.
Marek?
Yes?
I've seen there was a picture of biking, for instance, but isn't that sitting as well?
Yes, it is. It has its own problems, very similar to problems caused by prolonged sitting, but at least you have your heart pumping and.
Well, the back is not supported, but still you have something.
All right, I guess no more questions, so thank you again. Oh, sorry. Yes?
You gave us the result from the experiment with the company that introduced treadmills and stuff. How do those results translate to a situation situation where you only have a standing desk?
So, as I said, like the mere act of standing actually improves the situation a lot. So for starters, it makes your blood flowing. That's one thing. It burns, yeah, your body burns more calories by just the act of standing. But there are also a lot of advantages to the musculoskeletal system. So, for example, when we sit like all day long for weeks, months, and years, there's this very important muscle, iliopsoas, which just flexes the hips, and these muscles get shortened because of the fact. And when we stand up, it's like I'll exaggerate here, but it causes a hyperlordosis, right? And it affects all our movement patterns. So also, standing up resolves that problem. Yeah. Sorry.
How much should we stand? 5 minutes every hour, or?
Yeah. Sorry. So the question is, how long should we stand? So it really depends, and especially when you're starting with this. So that's a very important message to get from this talk. So even if you decide to try it out, don't get too ambitious, and don't try to stand all day long, because when you start out, you will get tired very quickly. And so you should just start with like 10 to 15 minutes of standing while your musculoskeletal system adapts to what it actually has been designed for in the first place. And it will take for me, it took 3, 4, 5 weeks, to be able to stand for an hour, 2 hours at a time without feeling tired and maintaining productivity. So you should just gradually increase the standing time in favor of standing, of course, over time. Yes, we had a question there. Yeah, so the question is, what is the opinion about the active sitting, like on a gymnastics ball? So Dr. Starrett's opinion, the author of the desk-bound book, is that he doesn't really like it, but he's kind of an extreme in his opinions because he argues that you should stand almost all the time. But the problem with gymnastics ball is the same as what I answered with the musculoskeletal system. You still have this muscle contracted. The same goes for riding a bike. So you should favor, standing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What health changes did you experience personally, and how long did it take? Did you recognize changes?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, what kind of health changes I observed in myself after introducing that. So definitely the things that I'm talking about, I did experience them, although I am not saying by any means that this is a silver bullet, that will solve all your problems. I think it contributed greatly to my well-being, but I also implemented other changes, in other areas of my life. But overall, I think it contributes greatly, positively. Yeah?
You just mentioned, okay, you increasing the time of standing, but which amount of time standing is enough? You can say, I'm safe, I'm standing enough per day, or you're standing all day long.
Mm-hmm. So the question is whether there's kind of an exact number of hours that you should stand, which is enough to circumvent these problems. And I'm not aware of any such answer. So I think it also boils down to awareness of your own body and able to listen to the signals that it's giving to you. And also someone said that the best position for human body is the next one. So if you notice that you're standing and you start to, supporting yourself, leaning, you're not maintaining this posture, it's time to sit down, basically, for you. One. I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
Regarding your own
You mean with the IKEA setup?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so there were two monitors, one normally at the desk, the other one was above on the table. I had two keyboards, right? A wireless mouse. It was just a matter of standing up and continuing the work.
So you had enough space.
Yes, yes. So this kind of solution comes with its own caveats, but it's also very, very cheap and very easy to try out. All right, so the time's up. Feel free to approach me. I'll be happy to answer more questions. Thank you.